holding the high watch is important. Holding the high watch in this world is essential. So I'd like first to ask how many of you are familiar with this phrase, high watch? Oh, marvelous. So for those of you who aren't, it's a term that's been around a very, very long time and is related to the ancient Hebrew tradition, actually Middle Eastern tradition, of building a watch tower in the middle of their fields. And for a few of you, you might like to know that that tower is called a Magdala. So that tower is where someone is making sure that the fields are okay, and that if anyone happens to be coming down the road, we know about it, whether they be friend or foe. So keeping the high watch was an important part of keeping everyone safe. Then about 150 years ago, we began to see in this country the emergence of a body of thought that we call a New Thought. And among those people was a woman named Emma Curtis Hopkins, and she saw what we do as individuals in the presence of what appears to be possibly distress as keeping the watch, the high watch, which to her meant keeping our eyes focused on the divine, omnipotent omnipresence that is always here instead of on the scrambles going on down here. Keeping the high watch. And she would, by the end of her life, after having created many different forms of associations and a couple of seminaries, form the High Watch Fellowship. And those are the people who kept her works alive when everyone else was beginning to forget it. So Emma Curtis Hopkins brought the High Watch Fellowship into our country in the 1890s and early 1900s, and we are the beneficiaries thereof. So it seemed to me that it was time for us to realize that although there are many, many, many pressures in this culture to look at the mess down here, maybe we want to look at that up there. That is the overarching goodness that is always present in our awareness. Now, there's multiple ways to do that, and one of those ways is to have an overview of what is really going on here. Now, when I began my work as a professional, I began with the Stanford Research Institute Center for Social Policy as a futurist. And our job was to look at emerging policies, emerging technologies, and suggest where they might be going for the next 25 to 50 years. Well, I was very young then. We have now come up on almost the ends of those forecasts that we did when I was starting out. And guess what? We were right. I'm sad to say. Because we saw and published papers for the government and for various other organizations that the current use of the various fuels we were using and the increase in electrical systems that were using other fuels meant that our concentration of carbon dioxide in the air, along with the concentration of methane in the air, was leading to an exponential increase, which would lead to the greenhouse effect, which would lead to what is called global warming, which would lead to rising seas, lots of wildfires, and storms. Mark's having a hard time deciding which image to use. Whatever works. We saw this when I was a teenager. Wow is right. And it turned out we were building our work on previous studies from before I was born. We've known this a very long time, Hans. And we've chosen as a nation, as a culture, to say, no, I'd rather have my toys. Don't, discount the future. It doesn't matter. What matters is my having my toys now. And in fact, in this marvelous book that one of my congregants handed me in a different church by Carolyn Baker called Sacred Demise, walking the spiritual path of industrial civilization's collapse. The spiritual path, my friends, the spiritual path. She says, most of us know that collapse is beginning to look like distress for everyone. Every day, the endangerment or imminent extinction of another species is announced. We're incessantly reminded of melting polar ice caps, plummeting of, I'm not going to go down the list, but you get what she's talking about. But then she says, but those manifestations of collapse are blatant and electrifying, but what about the more insidious indications, right? What about, the massive departures from religious movement, a colossally, this is her phrase, colossally dumbed down educational system, yeah, that produces valedictorians who cannot write a complete sentence in English. What about a healthcare system that is so broken and inequitable it doesn't even deserve the name health care? As ever new political scandals perpetrated by corrupt politicians erupt, and so on. Pretty ugly and pretty essential to look at in order to dissolve the belief systems that encourage us to experience them. Let me say that again. We look at the experience to dissolve the belief system that encourage us to experience them, because we experience what we believe, right? How can we have any shift, I'll just say it that way, shift from what we are experiencing if we don't take a look at the beliefs underlying them? What part of me believes that it's possible for any man in a high position of trust to break that? Oh dear. Or any woman in a high position of authority to be ignorant? Or any of the other things that we're constantly being told about on the media? What part of me believes that's possible? It may be that I had an experience when I was 2 or 3 or 6 or 7 or 15 or 18 that led me to think that was okay, that that happened in the world. And then I accepted that memory, that image, that idea as reality. And once I did, I was stuck with reinforcing the experience, repeating the experience. Oh dear. I guess I better go back and take a look. What beliefs did I adopt along the way that I need to look at now? So when I was agreeing to do this talk in this way, this book came my way. That's one of the Seth books. It's a Jane Roberts Seth book. Anyone here unfamiliar with Seth? Unfamiliar with Seth? Okay, so for those of you who are unfamiliar with this, a woman who had been writing poetry and science fiction was asked to do an article on psychic phenomena back in the late 60s, and she and her husband sat down with the very first thing they ever encountered, a Ouija board. A few of you played with that when you were kids, yeah. And they were amazed that that platen does move. You're sitting there holding it, and it's just taken off under their fingers. And it started to spell things out. And what it started to spell out was about questions about the afterlife. And he said, well, let me get some help here. And he became part of a larger group of beings, if you will, on the other side of the veil. And they started together answering questions. And after a while, they identified themselves as a composite being, spelled S-E-T-H, Seth. Now, Seth is an interesting name if you're aware of your biblical history, because when the Egyptian adopted Pharaoh's son was kicked out of Egypt, he went into the desert and he ended up connecting with a great householder with several daughters who were very attractive. And he became part of their household, and that man was Seth. And to this day, there are followers of that Seth in the desert between Egypt and Israel. Isn't that interesting? So Jane Roberts identified with some composite being and began to channel over time, began to actually go into trance. She never remembered a thing she said when she was in trance, and these words would come through her. And I think, well, the list of books on the front of the, where is it? There we go. This is the list of books, that whole page, from that Seth relationship, except the top two things which she wrote beforehand. If you're interested in Seth's and Jane Roberts' cosmology, she did write a series of novels about a character called Oversoul 7. It is the best way I know to understand what he's saying. But for this, the title of this is The Individual and the Nature of Mass Events. Oh my goodness. And we are in a mass event right now. The event being industrial civilization's collapse. Now, industrial civilization, to continue that larger picture, is everywhere now, isn't it? If you fly into another country, you are being part of the global industrial civilization. The airports look the same, the planes are the same, and everything is one culture at that level. Downtown, you're likely to see a mixture of local and global people, shops, all kinds of familiar things everywhere in the urban environment. So I call it the urban industrial culture. It is the evolution of Western civilization into what is now run by the corporate world. Yeah? So we are in the middle of a mass event, and that mass event is the collapse of that. And it is collapsing, and it must collapse because it is following a model that is so contrary to human nature and biological nature that it cannot survive. And every time an empire has been formed, it has gone through the same process. And we are simply the last of the great empires, going through the same process every single one has gone through for the 6,000 years empires have been happening. But humanity's been around a little bit longer than that. The most recent figures are 350,000 years for Homo sapiens sapiens. Who knew? Yeah, I know. I always thought it was 75, 80,000. But we keep finding more and more evidence every year. Just as they're finding more and more evidence of problems, they're finding more and more evidence of more life, including human life. So 6,000, 300,000. 6,000. It's a glitch. It's a minor glitch in human evolution and development. Even in Homo sapiens' experience on the planet, it's a minor glitch. We did a lot of damage in this glitch, but look what we can do now because of it. None of this that we are experiencing right this minute, literally none of it, would have happened without the development of empire culture and the industrial civilization. So it's not all bad. What hasn't worked is the disregard that we have experienced for this 6,000 years, for human life, for other forms of life, and for the ecosystems that we depend on for our lives. That's all that hasn't worked. And that's what needs to change. So, Carolyn Baker tells us that we need to develop something called an eco-psychology rather than an ego-psychology. And in order to do that, we need to begin to let go of the thoughts we have about who we are. And these are the foundations of our beliefs. She says, first, the process of collapse strips us of who we think we are so that who we really are may be clearly revealed. Civilization's toxicity has fostered the illusion that one is, for example, a professional person with money in the bank, a mortgage, good credit, healthy body, mind, et cetera, et cetera. If that has become our identity, and if we don't look deeper, we won't discover who we really are. And as collapse intensifies, we are then shattered because we have failed to notice the real strengths, resources, and gifts that abide in our essence, that transcend every situation we find ourselves in. One of the hallmarks of the empire culture is the notion of fear and control. If you keep people afraid, you can control them. And when they're in fear, they'll become controlling. It's a very interesting feedback loop, right? Fear leads to control, leads to fear, leads to being controlling, etc. Sigh. When we realize, as we look back on our lives, that in every single moment, even the most awful, dire, terrible moments we ever had experienced, everything we needed to get through that moment was present. Can we let go of the fear of what might be happening in the future? Every single moment, we have always had everything we need to get through that moment. And I have talked to guys who spent days in foxholes, and they acknowledge that. I have talked to women who've been in labor for days. Well, I was one of them. And everything we needed was totally there, every moment. There is a movement in the New Thought tradition called unity, and in that unity tradition there is a common prayer that was developed just at the beginning of World War II by various unity communities, by a poet, actually, the poet laureate for unity, James Dillett Freeman, to hand to the guys that were going overseas or that were, as they were going into the military. And it's a little tiny prayer. The light of God surrounds me. The love of God enfolds me. The power of God protects me. The presence of God watches over me. Wherever I am, God is, and all is well. The guys who put that little piece of paper in their helmet all came home. When we lift our vision out of the muck into the truth of our being, we are being the high watch. Seth says, if things are less than ideal in your society, then you can, as an individual, begin to change those situations. You do this by accepting the rightness of your own personhood. You do this by discarding ideas of unworthiness and powerlessness, no matter what their sources may be. You do this by beginning to observe your own impulses, by trusting your own direction. You start wherever you are today, period. When we know, when we can allow ourselves to maybe possibly believe that infinite power is always present, always with us, always guiding us, because, frankly, it's in us. We can't be separated from us. It really doesn't matter what the world around us is looking like. It's just an invitation to look more closely inside and see what beliefs we're ready to let go of or adopt. I love that Shreya shared this thing about heaven today, because I am of the very considered and well-informed opinion that what is actually happening is heaven is emerging because it's possible as a state of being, not only within us, but all around us. But very much the way the eggshell looks pretty ugly for the chicken to emerge, the civilization around us has to look pretty ugly for the heaven that we are to emerge. In the infinite all that is, we are the center, each of us, all of us. I love that image of the sphere and the ocean, yes? We are that drop. Where is it going here? There we go. Sticking to the wrong page. There we go. For a start, acknowledge your existence in the framework of nature. And nature is the all that is, the infinite all that is, as well as the local ecosystem and this incredible biosphere that we live on. And to do that, you must recognize the vast cooperative processes that connect each species with each other one. As the cells in our bodies are cooperating to bring forth this body experience now, all the species of this beautiful planet must cooperate for the planet as a whole to be. And we are part of that. And as we let go of the idea that we were handed growing up, that we are isolated, separated individuals and have to fight to have what we want, we begin to see how fully interconnected we are. The last time I looked at any document, it said there were 4,000 different species making up my body. 4,000 different species. Not just the several trillion cells that we document for each body. Isn't that amazing? We can't exist without the cooperation of multiple species. And we do exist. Therefore, cooperation is real and is the norm and must be the norm. Can't not be. When I say must, I say can't not, right? So as I lift my eyes out of the muck that people have suggested that I focus on and tell me I really should focus on, no. Thank you very much. I know what is happening. What is happening is a profoundly marvelous process by which each of us and all of us are becoming more fully who we are, leaving behind the childhood that our civilization attempted to keep us in. But that does mean leaving behind. My older daughter has a couple kids, and they have a tradition every year. Sometime around November, the kids have to go through their toys and let go of a few dozen. Initially, it was 2 or 3, and as they got older, it was 1 for every year they'd been on the planet. I kind of like that. Letting go. It wasn't always easy for these kids, but they began to realize that sharing was every bit as much fun as playing with them, sharing them, right? Many of us read a little book when we were teenagers, some of us as adults, read Little Women by the transcendentalist Louisa May Alcott. She was a neighbor of Ralph Waldo Emerson. He's the man in the book. The gentleman in the book is actually Ralph Waldo Emerson. Yeah. And she tells of the Christmas that while their father was at the war, he was a chaplain in the Civil War, while he was gone, their mother heard a story and went out on Christmas Eve and came back early Christmas morning and said, there is a family living in a cabin, 1 room, dirt floor, 5 children, and they do not have Christmas. Shall we take it to them? It was the high point of the girls' lives, wasn't it? To just take Christmas and share it with the family. So my kids, my daughter's kids, are learning to have some of that experience. Yes, Seth says, you cannot love your neighbor, in fact, until you love yourself. And if you believe that it is wrong to love yourself, then you are indeed unable to love anyone else. So when I said earlier, what beliefs do I need to let go of in order to be experiencing something other than what the universe is telling us or the media is telling us to experience? That is the foundation. It's okay to love me just as I am. And then I can love you just as you are. And then I can wake up to the realization that what we are loving is not necessarily the behaviors any more than I love the 2-year-old behaviors, right? Love that 2-year-old to pieces. Please don't do that again. Same is true for each and every one of us. When we know that everything we have ever longed for is right here, right now, can't be otherwise. That love, that life, that beauty, that joy, that sense of divine wisdom is always right here, in and through and as every one of us. And when we look at that, the muck literally dissolves. Our world becomes the heavenly state of being that is our birthright. Which is why we say, Namaste. Thank you. We'll talk more in a couple of weeks. Well, I'm told you all have been waiting with bated breath for me to take part 2. I'm honored. Thank you. There's about 6 places that I have thought of to start this talk. And as I've been hearing what people are feeling and thinking this morning, I'm going to shift into a place where I did not expect to go. I grew up in a household, many of you have heard about it, single mom. My mother had been in the Navy in World War II, and she taught flight gunnery, which, if you saw the movie Top Gun, the woman who was Charlie was my mother. That was what she did. Yeah. And she had a degree in fine arts, and after the war, she went back to graduate school, and she thought she'd get a master's degree, but things didn't work out very well, and there was this other war starting up. And so the people who knew what she could do hired her to do it at a distance. And so for Korea, my mother analyzed the films of pilots who were shooting down planes. And I grew up with my very first memories being crawling on the Civil Air Patrol map, moving the planes and the ships around. And every now and then I would ask about whatever she was up to, and I would hear things like, well, the friendly fire was much lower today. Things like that. The group that she worked for became known as the Institute for Air Weapons Research. And before I understood that you wouldn't normally have a list of names that includes Saturn and Minuteman in the same list, the first time I asked, how come we've got Minuteman on a list of Greek gods, I was kicked out of Mom's office. Because I didn't have a top secret clearance, and I shouldn't know about such things. I'm telling you all this because when I was 8, 9, 10, 11 years old, we were planning on what happened this weekend. I have lived my life, my whole life, in the awareness that this would be the tipping point for humanity. We just didn't know exactly who was going to push the button. And yet, you have heard me, and you have seen me, and you know, and for those of you who don't know, you're about to find out, I am absolutely convinced that humanity can and does and will rise above this. And humanity is going through a shift in consciousness such that the chaos we're experiencing today, in all the catastrophic events that we have experienced in the last few weeks and months especially, are simply the ending of something and the opening to a heavenly world. I've had a lifetime to learn this. And I invite you to step into this understanding with me. Thank you. And the reason I can do this is partly because I went to school to figure out why this was happening and how it was happening and what we could do. And I got a degree in anthropology and a degree in environmental studies, and then I went on into cybernetics. I ended up with a doctorate in futures research and impact assessment, and I understand the dynamics. And I'm happy to share them. And understanding the dynamics, to me, was the first step to allow me to step out of the fear and distress of the world that said the end is coming any minute. And that the nuclear war that will happen in the Middle East, we knew it would, that would be where it started, and hopefully where it ends. That it's not the end of the world. Along about 2008 and 2009, people started talking about 2012. Remember 2012? It was going to be the end of the world as we knew it. Well, as someone who had studied anthropology and was familiar with primarily Southwestern and Central American cultures, I understood that no, in the transition stages of those cultures, each stage is called a world. The culture as we know it falls apart, so a new culture and a new consciousness can emerge. The Navajos and the Hopis and the Mayans have slightly different models, but they're basically the same model. A world ended in ice. We call that the glaciation of the planet. A world ended in mud. We call that the melting of the glaciers. A world ended in water, and we call that the rains that followed and the great floods. that are all over the planet. Cultures all over the world have gone through the world ending, and the world simply means this epoch, this way of being, this knowing that we have been living. And the Mayans loved calendars. They had 121 different calendars. And all of those calendars fit into one great calendar called the Great Cycle. And so along about 2009, 2010, I'm writing about this and I'm teaching about this and helping people get that what is happening now is part of a great cycle. And what happened at noon on December 21, 2012, was rainbows showed up all over the planet on the winter solstice at the middle of the day. Does anyone know how rainbows work? You have to have a low sun and rainy. You know how rainbows work. I'm glad. The sun has to be quite low and there has to be rain over there for a rainbow to happen, right? Yeah. This is the middle of the day. Right on. And we had rainbows at noon, actually ongoing. And in some places it was snowing, and there were rainbows. It was fascinating. And so for me, that was, in the Judeo-Christian tradition, the reminder that Noah said, I'm not ever, God told Noah, I'm not ever going to end the world this way. I'm not going to do this. Right? So that was 2012. Now, part of what the Mayans were telling us is that on 2012, the sun would be rising and setting in a particular part of the Milky Way that is pretty much empty compared to the rest of this incredibly glowing mass. And it would rise at that point, and it would be entering what's called, this empty place, the womb in the Mayan tradition, the womb of the Milky Way. And that was not the end, but the beginning of a transition. And the transition was from that winter solstice over the next several years to another winter solstice, which happened to be 2021. And the sun was on the other side of the womb on that day. The winter solstice, 12/21/21. And during that whole period, the date of the winter solstice on our calendar was December 21. Isn't that interesting? Because it moves around a little bit on our calendar. I'm giving you all this because that whole thing that happened about the world's coming to an end was really, no, the world is going through a process in which a transition is happening, and we're at the beginning of the transition, which is the beginning of the end of culture that we thought we had to be living in and we're stuck with for eternity. Well, what was going on? Does anyone happen to remember what was going on in 2021? COVID, the pandemic. The ending of 2021, the ending of that womb period was everybody got shook up a whole bunch, and millions of people got broken out of the trance of the materialist consumer culture that said we had to be wage slaves to survive. Millions of people. Do you know, in 2023, 11 million working age men refused to apply for a job because they'd figure out other ways to make a living. The employment department got really confused in the US because the numbers did not work. Because this wake-up call, this transition period that we call the pandemic had happened, and people were beginning to fall out of the trance of Western empire industrial culture. Well, we have another whole new cohort since then. It's been 4 years, so we've got another set of graduates from high school and college that have been partially indoctrinated into this, but they had those COVID years too. And they realized that the lockstep system of public education, and you got to go to whatever to get whatever. Thank you, that's very cool. is not real. It is a thought form. It is a cultural norm, and it isn't who we are. So who are we? Who and what is humanity? As we look across time and we look across cultures, we see there are some fundamental core ideas. And one of the things I love about CSA is a lot of you got to listen for a lot of hours to some of those fundamental core ideas in other traditions and in the sciences. All right? And so the sciences that I came from overlapped a little bit with Dr. Bill's. But in the social sciences and in cybernetics and the systems sciences, we're looking at processes and dynamics. And we begin to see, and as an anthropologist, we see patterns. We see how this culture over here is doing very much what this culture over here is doing. How much of that is training and how much of that is the innate nature of humanity. Very little of what we do is in the innate nature of humanity. I got to tell you that. Competition is not innate. It is trained. We are trained to compete. Cooperation and love is innate. It's born in us. Yes? So that's why whenever we're in that place of cooperating and mutual support, we feel so good because we're not in a dissonance, fighting our natural nature. Yes? Okay. Now, with all of that in mind, we live and are part of this system that we call the earth, or we call the universe. And this is a living system, and living systems have a process. And I've touched on this before, I'm going to do it again. This process is you start with a seed, the seed begins to grow, and it starts reaching out and connecting with other beingnesses, other forms of being. And they're interacting and forming structures, and those structures interact and they get stronger and stronger in the environment that's constantly offering changes and possibilities. And they get more and more structured in that environment until one day one of those regular little things happens and everything falls apart. It might be a windstorm in a forest. It might be just a lightning spark that would normally have just done a little bit of damage, but now because everything is so intertwined and so overgrown, it does a lot of damage. It might be in a human body. This particular day, my immune system is such that because of all the environmental things and all the structures I'm dealing with, this particular germ, microbiology germ, and I did study microbiology, so I know what we're really talking about here. Anyway, this little thing upsets the whole system and I fall apart, right? We call that the catastrophe. And there's a whole body of theory around that called catastrophe theory. Isn't that cool? We really care about what happens in our lives, right? So the catastrophe, I love it. The catastrophe theory that we have begun to understand after looking at this stuff in biological systems and in human cultural systems, we see that there are a couple of directions that systems can go. If the system is attached to what was, in a culture, if we're attached to the world we were living in, the culture that we did call normal, then this catastrophe leads to a huge period of chaos, because we're trying to make that happen when it isn't possible anymore, because that depended on a whole lot of things that don't exist anymore because of the catastrophe. And so when that happens, when people stay attached to the past and this catastrophe has happened and this chaos is happening, the system generally fails. It falls apart and dissolves, and maybe a remnant survive. And that actually is the language of some of the Native American prophecies. But if the catastrophe happens and the members of the culture or of the ecosystem are focused on the mutual support of the seeds that can be born now, then a whole new system emerges based on that seed. Now, that seed is usually, in human cultures, a culture based on a higher state of consciousness. In every one of the prophecies, and in the Hopi myth, it's all in present tense, and it's there is this thing falling apart, and then the people rise to a new level, and it falls apart, and they rise to a new level. In the Mayan great cycle, there's actually a way you can depict it as a steps in a pyramid, so that as each one ends, you move to another step. And each one is a new level of consciousness, a new level of spiritual awakening, yes, and awareness. Sometimes it can be very gentle. I have spent the second half of my life attempting to make it be very gentle, rather than be something that was a worldwide conflagration in which everyone suffers. I worked as a futurist and realized, whoops, my reports and all of our hard work on all of our teams are very well received and then put on a shelf. People aren't implementing it. That was very hard. It was my catastrophe because I realized I can't continue to do this, and I have to find a way through. I had what was my 3 days in the tomb. It was very much like a near-death experience. It wasn't an actual one from the outside, but it was from the inside, I gotta tell you. And on the other side of it, it became quite clear that all of my efforts to be a good girl and not be the spiritual entity with great intuitive understanding that I had been when I was 2, 3, and 4 had to be undone. And I had to go into being a spiritual teacher, healer, and presence. I made a bargain with God at that time. I said, I will do this, but no more knifings, burnings, and tortures, yes? Because I have physical memories of what might be called past life experiences as a spiritual teacher and healer. And I got that time is over message. The world is ready. And very soon after that, I heard another layer of the Mayan prophecy, and it was that as the world based on material technology comes to an end, the emerging world that has been made possible because of all that materialistic technological development will be based on spiritual awakening, awareness, and power. We are the power. Thank you for saying that in your treatment. There is just as enough power in this room to transform everything. There is enough power right here. I'm sure Dr. Bill has showed you. There's enough power right there between my hands to power New York. All the electricity of New York can be when we know how to access it. What the Mayans understood is that we now know how to access it, and the new culture of which we are the seeds is already unfolding as a spirit-based culture rather than a matter-based culture, in which the material world aligns more and more effectively, efficiently, and immediately on our state of consciousness. In the culture we all grew up in, although I know some of you had a little bit of other culture as well, and I'm so glad because you're part of why we can make this happen. Anyway, in this Western culture, in this industrial culture, we were taught that the only way I can make a change is to move something physical. Not so. But as long as I believe that, then I am not a very powerful person. I mean, I can carry 50 pounds, maybe 70 if I work at it, involve my hips. Right? I can have a kid on each side. I can't lift a lot of things. That makes me not very powerful in a material world. In a communications and information world, which was the next set of studies that I did, in cybernetics, it's about information. And as we began to work with that, then we had more power, right? Our information age says someone without much physical power can make a huge difference. The military network into the universities. So I've been kind of around this for a while, you know. So we're in this internet world where the information that we're developing in different places is all coming together and made available to everyone, to the point where some people say if you're ignorant in today's world, it's a choice. Which makes me wonder about some of the members of our government, which is as far as I'll go in politics today. So as we go through that and understand that information is accessible and is powerful, and anybody of any size, shape, or disability or ability can make a difference. That was the transition out of the material culture. And part of what happened with that was we opened ourselves to information from other cultures. And for me, the turning point was 1965. And I've said this in here before. Okay, think about those of you who were around on the planet, but if you weren't around on the planet, you know from your history books, all right? 1965, 1967. Oh, I saw something interesting last night. The place I'm staying has Roku TV. And one of the channels is the Ed Sullivan Show. And in 1965 to 1967, that man introduced every new thing that was happening on the planet. I was blown away. I didn't watch it last night, but I was going, okay. All right, so Rachel Carson, Silent Spring came out in 1963. The Beatles came to the U.S., 1965, right? We're going to go on and on and on. All the things that happened in that period that is the middle of the 1960s. And it just happens to be when all the baby boomers came into their maturity. It was the turning point. It was when the seed got planted so that it could emerge through the catastrophes and the chaos of the transition from one form of culture to another form. Now, one of the things about culture dynamics was laid out by a guy who wrote a book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. Thomas Kuhn. Great book. And he pointed out that when a new theory comes on the scene, all the old guys are saying, no way, can't be. We know how it works. There is no way that new idea could work. Right? Happens every time. Well, it happens in the culture as well, not just in the scientific world. New things come on board. When I was tracking things as a futurist, I knew that things had become mainstream when they hit the women's magazines. Meditation hit the women's magazines right about 1990. Right on. Remember when Yogananda came to the country? Yeah. It took almost exactly 75 years from when Vivekananda and Yogananda were here for meditation to become mainstream in this country. When I went to high school, we did not learn about the theory of relativity. It wasn't mainstream yet. Almost everybody on the planet has heard the equation E equals mc squared now, and thinks they understand something about this thing called the theory of relativity. But the concept of relativity became part of mainstream culture. Well, Einstein published that paper in 1906. And it was the 1990s, late 1980s, when people started, and everybody knew this equation. So it takes 75 years. All right. So where I'm going here is 1965, 2025. We're 60 years into this new possibility, becoming mainstream. Whoa. Did you ever think you might ever be mainstream? 2040. 2040 is the mainstream. Yeah. And most of us in this room, if we choose to stick around to help make it happen, and that's why we are on the planet right now, is to help make this happen, yes, we will be here when the ideas established in the mid-60s are made into a culture norm. Yes. Yes. All over the world, because of the technological developments that went on through the 1970s, through the 2000s. Now we're just modifying what was already there. They call it AI. We were doing language learning models and expert systems with my students a number of years ago. It's been around a while. It's just they figured out a way to make money off of it. That's all that happened. But to be able to access online any information at any time, that had to become mainstreamed, and it did. So I'm playing with these ideas so you can get a sense that we can rise above in our intellect the mess that's going on around us, because we know this mess is just part of an ongoing process. Childbirth is messy. You know, it can be easy if you're properly trained, but it's still messy. Yeah, there's a lot of liquids that need to be cleaned up. Yeah, and that's basically what's happening. A new form of humanity is being born, who will live out of spiritual awareness rather than consuming material artifacts. There will continue to be material artifacts because we live in a 3D world, but they will not be the focus of our experience. And they will depend on and show up as the manifestation of our state of consciousness right now, and we will know how to do it. And we're beginning to already. I watch a fair number of YouTube videos because of the research that I'm doing. Again, I'm scanning the culture. And I am blown away by the hundreds of videos out there on how to manifest, bring forth an experience that you want to have the experience of. Quantum leaping, some people call some of that. It's just fascinating. It's becoming normal for a sector of our culture to experience that. So what happens? How can I, having grown up the way I grew up, having known the things I have known since I was a very young child, not get caught up in the emotions around what is happening around us now? Well, intellectually, I got a whole big framework I can refer to, thank God. But I have also this toolkit that we call New Thought. And the first step in this toolkit is the first step in the song we sing and in the treatment that Sherry gave us. Realizing that all that really exists is one beingness, and that beingness is lovingness. It can't be anything else. And I can explain that to you in physics, or Dr. Bill can. But it has to be that. It can't be anything else. And that's all that is. Therefore, anything else that I'm experiencing is not what is. It's the function of my state of consciousness. And it has taken a while to show up. When I heard the news about what was happening this weekend, I went, oh no, I thought I had eliminated that from my thinking. Apparently I hadn't. Because we can only experience what's already in our belief system. So where do we start? We look at our environment. We look at what we are bringing forth in our life. That is what we believe. Ow. If we're seeing distress, it's because we have believed distress is possible. If we are seeing a process unfolding as gently as it can possibly unfold, that's where our beliefs are. So our first step is to choose the knowing. It is all good. It can't be other than all good. It is love and joy and peace. I'm not talking about some abstract good. I'm talking about what feels good now. That's what's real. Last time I got accused of not talking long enough. Now I'm going to talk too long. When I know that all that is real is what feels really good, that's called choosing principle. Everything else is the result of past states of consciousness showing up in the reflection that is the world. There's a whole body of theory called the reflexive universe. And there is a whole body of theory having to do with resonance and morphic change. So if I want to see the world as heavenly, I have to let go of any beliefs that it is not heavenly and start seeing and feeling what we're seeing around us in the world today, right here in Monterey and Pacific Grove. Yes? That's heavenly. This is heavenly. This is as close as we are capable right now to experience the truth and the reality of being. And then that gets us to the next state. When I'm in that being, I've chosen the principle, I know the goodness, that feeling of goodness is all that can be real, then I start seeing it in my inner vision, and I am literally, and the science supports this, I am literally projecting into that out there what is going on in here. And I've done a whole series of radio shows on that called Noetic Moments, if you want to know more. So eternal heaven is the reality. Thank you for that beautiful slide. Because that is who and what we actually are. We are this infinite spiritual being with infinite power to make the world around us. And we have been doing it all our lives, but we were unconscious. We were unaware. We were caught in the trance of a culture that said we couldn't do it and kept us caught up in another form of being. But we are no longer. We are awake. And because we are awake, we can let go of any idea other than the reality that heaven and earth are one. If you study the Course in Miracles, you know this in the intellect. Now bring it down. Bring this awareness that what we thought were two separate states are actually the reality of us, and it is what we are now being, and therefore must experience. We can't not experience it. We are being. Heaven and earth is one. I don't care what tradition you come from, whether it's the Judeo-Christian tradition, the Buddhist tradition, the Hindu tradition, all of them point in this direction. The one is, and we are it, and it is all good. Yes. When I'm in my shamanic journeys that have saved my life more than once, oh my goodness, I can feel all of these beings, all these archetypes throughout all that is, saying, wake up, it's here. The seed is here. Allow the new culture. You don't need to grieve and fear and be angry about what has been. You just need to let it go and allow the new belief, the new understanding. Be the high watch that sees only the good, only the heavenly process unfolding. That's our job. Thank you very much.